Indiana Disability History Project, Indiana Institute on Disability and Community, Indiana University.
Jenny Todd, it is August 15th, 2017, and we are in Indianapolis. And you are?
Don Melloy, and long time resident of Indianapolis. So.
Okay, so what I'd like you to talk about. Okay, so I'm Jenny Todd again, and you are?
And I'm Don Melloy, father of Cindy Melloy, who's developmentally disabled.
Okay, Don, so you talked about or I'd like you to talk about your experiences with ARC and the early days of how it kind of got going, why it got going, and your role in the ARC.
Well, I don't remember the exact dates. It was in the late 60s, early 70s when I was on the board, had been on the board for a very short period of time of the Indiana ARC, and they asked me to work on the objective of developing an ARC in every county in Indiana. And we realized that there was not one in Indianapolis or Marion County. And so that became a primary objective, in addition to many trips to other counties after getting off from work to encourage people to farm and the advantages of having an ARC in their county, a local ARC.
Can you tell me what a local ARC is and what the advantages would be for people that don't know what an ARC is?
Well, yeah, the Association and it's gone through many iterations. It was the Association for Retarded Children in the beginning, and that was changed to Retarded Citizens, and that was changed to some other less identifying names. And finally, the state association decided that it was just the ARC of Indiana. And that was the same thing that happened on a national level at the national ARC of USA, it's called, I believe. And in Marion County, we went from Marion County Association for Retarded Children to Retarded Citizens, and then to just the ARC of Marion County. And then the name Noble came into it, and that had some background with some of the people that were put together in that period of time to form the local ARC. And some of the early meetings were held on what was then known Noble Street, and I think that's where they got the name. That is now called, I believe, College Avenue, isn't it?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think that it made an extension of College Avenue at some point in time. Regardless, we had the issue that always came up in those days, and this was a growth thing in these associations, a huge gap between parents. And at that time, these associations were heavy concentration of parents doing the majority of the volunteer work and paid work in many cases, between what was called educable mentally handicapped and trainable mentally handicapped. And I found in going around the state and meeting with organizations, they didn't want to talk to one another. It was rather humorous, I thought, but it wasn't humorous to them. And I remember going to one county where I finally got them to agree to have a meeting, and I was all set, and I drove up. There was some distance from Indianapolis after I got off from work, and at the very last moment, one of the groups backed out. And it subsequently, over the years, though, as younger people got involved, I believe they had more influence, and that had a great influence on it, and those kind of separations no longer exist.
Why did people start creating ARCs? Why were there local associations?
The original focus was to provide programs for children, handicapped children, who were being excluded by the public school systems. and it, generally speaking, concentrated on school-age children. And in Marion County, the early group, Parents and Friends, I think they were called, even had a school that they had started for children. But they in themselves had barriers in their minds that it wasn't all handicapped children. There was some distinction between degrees of handicap. And those were artificial barriers that kept arising over the many years of development. But most of them were well-intentioned, overwhelmingly well-intentioned people who saw the need to bring together an organization that could exercise influence in the county to get education extended to all handicapped children. And hence we then got into the deal of pushing as it began to grow on a national level in Washington, D.C., in fact, influence coming out of Washington, D.C. was causing local organizations and all the way up to the state level to look at this education of handicapped people in a different light. And it became then almost like a civil rights movement, inasmuch as these children were entitled to the same opportunities for education as anyone else. And there were many hiccups along the way, But everyone involved was meeting with the same objectives, more or less, to get this all passed. And as I think Mary Lou has told you, through great effort, this Operation Child Hunt that went on and other activities, interviewing the superintendents in Marion County alone. There were 11 school districts, and all of that came together when the federal government passed mandatory legislation for special education. And the work that was done in Marion County was very beneficial to that, because this county was in a better position then to begin rolling out those programs. And it varied between school districts tremendously. Some were very willing and excited about this needed to be done, and others resisted. But over the years, it was a rough bit of effort by everyone, but we did get those things done.
I'm going to take you back just a little bit. Since the ARC is a national organization, and this is an Indiana history project, when did Indiana get on the bandwagon? Were they an early ARC member? Were they late to the game? I mean, when did Indiana get involved with the ARC movement?
Well, the state association was, as I remember, one of the early participants in the ARC movement. But there was a lot of resistance in the state, and we encountered that. I don't know if Mary Lou mentioned our experiences when we moved to Columbus, Indiana. They wanted to exclude Cindy, and many people all over the state started doing these same kind of things where they could. But there was a local radio station there that had some kind of a women's or ladies' breakfast of a morning broadcast, and just people would call in and just talk about their problems and issues they were facing. And she talked to them and got those people interested in this whole movement. And when the schools down there said, knowing that we would have trouble doing this, she took it upon herself to encourage the lady that hosted that to say, how many people out there have handicapped children that they want to send to school? And this was in reaction to the school corporation that told us, well, so if you find me 14 other children and or 12 other, whatever the number was, and we'll put together a class. And in response to that radio work, I can't remember what it was, 35 or 33 people came forward with handicapped children. And we got that all set up, and the company transferred us, and we didn't go back and say we weren't going to be there. Mary Lou, and that's to be expected in the society that moves people around the way they did.
Go ahead and
Put
put
your
your mic
mic
on.
on.
You
Yeah.
don't have to hold it.
I'm sorry I got
No,
that
that's
wrapped up
fine.
in my big feet here
So-
somehow.
So the ARC wasn't in every county originally.
Not at all.
So do you remember, and when Peggy steps away, we can talk about this, but do you remember how many counties or which counties it started in, and then how long it took to become in every county?
So far as the numbers, I cannot remember those things at all. They're both in there on the desk, Mary
Both
Lou.
of the phones?
Yeah,
All right, we'll just wait a minute till she's the phone.
that's a nice sound to have in the background. What are those
Much
spooks
better
doing?
than my phone.
Well, you could change it. You know, most of these phones.
Change my phone probably.
I had my cell phone, the other one. They don't have it an option on here. It played harps, and every time it'd ring, it'd say, "I'm getting ready."
Okay, so when you were in Indiana, there were a few counties that had ARCs, and then how did it move around?
Well, principally, it moved around through the efforts of the committee that was put together to expand it. And the way that happened was I would search out and through the ARC's director at the time and such, he had made contacts in other counties and was given names, and I'd just work with those people and say, hey, let's get together and talk about this, you know. And it really involved beating the pavement and getting out and making the contacts and just talking face to face with people about what we were trying to accomplish. And I don't think any county originated the activity while I was in that capacity to, hey, we want a farmer, come and help us. You know, that didn't happen. We initiated all of it, as I recall. And to keep in mind, that was many, many years ago. And
So you pretty much went to the counties and helped them get started.
yes,
They weren't saying, "Oh, yeah, we're going to do this." That Bartholomew.
no,
Okay.
no.
And do you know how long it took to get an ARC in almost every county? Did it take 10 years or 5 years?
I suspect it was close to 10 years before, and it never did evolve into one in every county. What happened was in some counties you had a consolidation of the counties, and they formed an agency for 2 or 3 counties, you know, and that was very effective because the incidence factor in more rural counties is obviously, because the population is lower, was not as great, and therefore you couldn't justify a single agency, but by combining them, they were very successful in several of these, and to my knowledge, still today, they are.
So initially, all the ARCs were parent-run, lots of volunteers. You want to talk about how they kind of went from parent volunteer to having money to hire staff and grow their organization?
It started out, and you have to give a lot of credit to the United Way and similar community NFPs, not-for-profits, that raised funds for various charitable activities in the county. And they were very instrumental in funding these initial efforts. An example would be the Marion County Association. My figures are not right to the dollar, but I recall that our first year as an agency, Marion County, there was a our budget was like $111,000, and 90,000 of that came from the United Way. So that's was really what. Now over the years, there were fund drives and volunteer efforts, and locally, I have to mention the Broad Ripple Sertoma Club which it's not germane to this, is now the largest Sertoma club in the United States. You know, those type of organizations are diminishing significantly, but they are continuing to grow. And they started out supporting the parents and friends over in the Butler area, and have over the years, I think they maybe a year or two ago, they reached over $1 million that they had contributed to the ARC for these activities. And they even built a house there on that one campus to where the old Park Tudor School was. And the purpose of that was to teach children, handicapped children as they get older, to live in a house and be responsible for activities in the house and such. So all of these things were driven by the ARC movement. And the ARC movement goes, as any organization goes through phases. There were times when the principal focus was to educate the youngest and the children and bring them on. Then it also moved into development of sheltered workshops. And then over the years, when mandatory special ed came in, that activity diminished when it came to educating them. Although there still is a significant program that it's called, I just lost the name of it. What is that, Marlo? They were, the secretary's kids went. You know, preschool. They had a strong preschool program for handicapped children that were identified at birth or thereabouts. And that became a very, very strong program and is active today. And then the cycle is changing on sheltered workshops. They don't like that. They don't call them that anymore. There's more and more of an effort to put the adult handicapped out in the employment community, to work in the community alongside of normal people, with parentheses. It's hard to judge what is normal in today's world, I suppose, but it has been very beneficial in many ways. And we were reluctant when they said Cindy ought to be in the community working, and very reluctant. And I don't know, Mary Lou, did you talked about that, so I don't need to cover that again. And we, having fought for all these changes and improvements and better things, finally reached a decision on our own to say, you know, if we're going to be out here trying to help this situation, we got to be willing to accept what comes along and at least give it a try. And it was the best thing we ever did. And so, but the growth has been astronomical. That $111,000, I don't know now what Noble's budget is, but it's in the millions, and that was a good program. And that's been the story all over the state. Now, it takes different forms, you know. Vincennes went on the form of having they didn't even call it a workshop, sheltered workshop. They called it an industry. It was their own business. And they had handicapped people and normal people working side by side. And that's been a very successful program down there. So and that's just one I can remember right this minute. It's all over like that. Now, one of the things that I think has changed and needs more attention has to do with the funding sources. In many agencies, as the government began to put more tax dollars into these, which I think was a very appropriate thing to have happen, the agencies then relied less and less on parents. And consequently then, new parents were less and less involved. I think the agencies missed something by that. But most of them are being very successful and are serving a need in the community, and the individual handicapped people that they're serving are the beneficiaries of that. We can always look and find places where it breaks down, and that's not limited to agencies that serve the handicapped. That's in all aspects of our life. We'll find areas that break down and things happen that you don't want to happen. But none of these agencies, to my knowledge, has there ever been a case where there was an intentional problem created by one of these agencies. They all seem to step up, and we have met some really outstanding people in these fields.
Well, one thing that I think would be fun to hear, because we did interview John Dickerson at length, and if you could talk about when John came to apply for the job, or interviewing John, and then kind of his role through the years, if you've stayed in touch with it.
We have, and we still consider John a very good friend.
He said, talk about the early days of meeting John Dickerson.
Well, John came to what is now Noble of Indiana, or I think that's what they call it now, the Marion County Association, and I don't know how long he'd been out of college, but not very long. And he was young and energetic, as most of these people are. They come in excited about it, and we talked about hiring him. He was a good applicant, and so we did, feeling that he would grow as we moved into it. And if there ever was a case of a man who did, it's John Dickerson. John pitched in, and now he's had the personality that would challenge the old school all the time. And while many folks are going to say, we don't need this, what's he doing coming in here, this young kid, and telling us things? That's good that he did that, because good things happen when you take a look at other outside, the old phrase, thinking outside the box. It's not always going to be the way you think it's going to be. And good things happen. And John was a very good addition to the staff there, and then moved on to the state and has done an outstanding job as director of the state. And some of the things you've seen, one is up at Muncie, Indiana, where they've got that program going with training people in the hotel industry staff and such, and they even built a hotel, and in conjunction with appropriate businesses. And to my knowledge, that's been very successful. And you have to have people coming into any organization that are willing to take a look at it from a different point of view. And I've served on the boards of many agencies, and I've served in that role with that John had played with us as a staff member in making changes from an old established organization that brought it into the 21st century, or in my case, the 20th century at least. And so that's something that we've always admired about John. Not always that we agreed with him eye to eye, but I would be very disappointed if that were not true. Just because you don't agree readily with someone does not mean that both of you don't have good ideas about how to get the job done. See? And so that's been a real experience for us. And so.
Produced by the Center for Health Equity, Indiana Institute on Disability and Community, Indiana University. Funded in part by a grant from the Indiana Governor's Council for People with Disabilities. Copyright 2018, the Trustees of Indiana University.